Everyone, it's good to see you here today. I'm sorry I've only just arrived. As my good friend Ben intimated, my son was sick on the bus ride down here, but he's now better, and so we're here. So happy with that. Me shikya wenzwani ila Myaamia Center ne Pangya Myaamia mission Kaninge. My name is George Ironstrack, and I'm a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, as well as I have the honor to work with our young people up at Miami University. I work at the Myaamia Center. I'm the assistant director, and I head up the Office of Education and Outreach. And I've been asked today to talk to you a little bit about storytelling, or might be better to say story listening. I always have the great honor of following my friend Ben Barnes, which is a terrible act to follow. So I'll try and be as entertaining and as brief as possible. But much like Ben, wasn't trying to, in one session, train anyone to lead a stomp dance, either as a shaker or a singer. He's trying to get you to understand enough to follow in a way that helps you feel comfortable and enjoy things tomorrow night. My goal today is just to help you follow along in storytelling, so to really learn how to listen. Which, for those of you who've taken anthropology courses, you know that there's a whole train of thought among anthropologists, and in some cases among historians, that you actually have to learn how to listen when you enter a community that's not your own, or if you didn't grow up in a community. So I didn't grow up in the Myaamia community as a young child. I had to learn many of these things as an adult. How do you listen to your people's stories? How do you listen to the voices of your own community? It's not the same in every community. It's an image that Julie Old painted that represents one of the stories that you may hear when you attend some of our storytelling about Wapangwa and Glenazwa. And so we're going to talk today mostly about Alasukana, about winter stories, but we'll talk a little bit about Achimuna, about historical narratives. But we don't really have any plans to tell historical narratives tonight, so we probably won't talk about them much. But if you have questions at the end, I'm happy to talk about them. So an overview of where we're going really quickly is that first we're going to talk about what are Myaamia stories, what constitutes the core of Myaamia storytelling traditions, who are Myaamia storytellers over time and today, how are Myaamia stories recounted, so how are they retold in our community in settings like this as well as other stories, other settings, and then lastly, why do we tell our stories? What's the purpose behind recounting our stories as people? So to the first question, what are Myaamia stories? So primarily, as I said, the stories you're going to hear tonight are Alasukana, are winter stories. And they're stories that are told during a particular time of year. They're told when after the hard frost in the fall, when the frogs go silent, all the way through Pepunge, all the way through the winter, until the frogs start singing again in the spring, and the first thunderstorms arrive, when the Chungwe and Zake return. And that brings a winter storytelling time to an end. This is the primary source that we use today, the primary grouping of our winter stories, as well as our historical narratives. It's in this publication that Dr. David Costa put together. In that publication, there are 45 stories. 29 of them are bilingual in Myaamia and Hiwalia, Peoria, and the Miami language. It's the same language. And then there's 16 stories that are in English only. The Achimuna are historical narratives. They can be told at any time of year. During winter storytelling time, we oftentimes gravitate to the things that are precious that we can't tell any time of year. And we tell the Achimuna all year round. Sometimes the Alasukana are called fables or mythological stories by outsiders. But as you'll see, hopefully you get a sense of right now, as well as you'll see later tonight, that's not really a good internal interpretation of them. That's not how we think of our stories. And I'll get at the very end of this presentation, talking about why we tell them. It should be very clear that they're not simply myths to us. And the only other thing I want to mention is that while this is the primary source, most of the stories you're going to hear tonight, I think all of them come from this collection, which took Dr. Costa over 20 years of work to assemble into a means that we can actually use it as a community. There are other stories recorded by multiple other sources across time that didn't make it into this publication. And those stories we're slowly figuring out how to incorporate into the repertoire of our community, into the storehouse of stories. And so over the coming years, you may hear new stories from those collections. So who are Myaamia storytellers across time as well as today? In that collection are stories collected from Myaamia people by outsiders, linguists, historians, anthropologists, and these are the people that they collected from. So we want to pay, tonight we won't name them when we're in the big setting fun stories, but we'll reference them. These are the people who made a very difficult decision around the late 1800s to sit down with folks and record our stories in Myaamia and English so that they would be here for us today. It's a really important decision that they made. It was probably not an easy one. So we have Wikapamija here, Wikapamija on the left, Sarah Wadsworth, who is Ria Myaamia. Wapanaki Kappa, Gabriel Godfrey, who is Myaamia. And on the far right, Shuana Kipwa, Nancy Stan, who is Tewalia. In the upper left, we have Lenapingia, Frank Beaver, William Sky, we don't know his Tewalia name, Chingwenza, William Pakanga, and Wapemangwa, Thomas Richardson. And my personal favorite storyteller, Tuafakananga, George Finley, together with his daughter Lena and his son Leo. Which Lena recorded a bunch of ancillary material about her father's storytelling traditions, which is really cool information that I'll talk about again in a second. And there's a couple folks we don't have pictures for. We're still hunting for them. We really like when we talk about these folks to have us be able to look at their faces when we remember them and recognize them for their work. But Pisha Kokwa, Elizabeth Valier, who's Myaamia and Tewalia. We don't have a picture for her yet, but quite likely we'll eventually get one. And Sarah Jane Cass Kaiser, who's Myaamia. Again, there's a chance eventually we'll find a picture of her out there. And then there were a slew of unknown tellers who were recorded in the late 1800s. We say unknown, the anthropologists who recorded them probably knew who they were, just didn't bother to write their names down. So it's sort of a sign of, in that period of time, the mix of respect that some anthropologists and linguists were showing to Native people, and in some cases, just kind of sloppiness and disrespect for what they were contributing. And then, of course, that's just the people of the late 1800s who had maintained this body of knowledge that could pass it on, but they got it from the generations before them, right? So these stories stretch back for generations untold, back to before our people even migrated into the lower Great Lakes, living someplace in the north, as Tuaquaquananga said. So we have to pay respect to those folks as well, the generations unnamed and uncounted who carried these stories forward so that they could be here for us today, to help us understand who we are as a people, who we were as a people, and who we want to be going forward. And then, while I kind of took a little dig at some of the anthropologists and linguists out there, many of them were quite considerate and quite careful and became very good friends with the people they worked with, because we want to recognize their work as well, right? So they did a lot of the work of recording that then David Costa could go find to process and edit and publish into materials that we can use today. And so their work is also is invaluable. Even the ones who are dismissive, their work in the end sometimes becomes invaluable. And then there's the storytellers today. So this is the group who told stories here last year. So in our community, there are lots of individuals, members of our community, who are learning to tell stories of all different ages, from elders all the way down to, little kids are trying to learn how to tell stories. Probably as it always was in our community. Some folks in our community are recognized as being especially skilled at storytelling, who've worked harder at it or have some of the natural stage presence that comes with performing stories, with breathing life into these very important stories. And over time, if you spend enough time in our community, you'll realize who those people are, who are kind of held up as storytellers. So this picture in no way represents all of them. It's a wide, diverse group, but it's those who are here telling stories last year. I think it is fair to say in our community, while there are elders who are storytellers, compared to other communities, we are kind of age-graded younger in terms of those who are telling stories. And that's partly a product of our language and culture revitalization effort, which tends to skew younger right now. So we've talked about, what are Myaamia stories and who are Myaamia storytellers over time. Now we're talking about how, what's the process for which Myaamia stories are recounted. So a bigger storytelling event, a formal storytelling event, we usually begin with an opening oration. So in this case, tonight I'll be doing that. And the oration sets the tone for the evening, reminds everyone of the purpose why we're gathered here, the respect that the stories are due, the context, the proper context in which the stories are to be told, and oftentimes tries to set a specific tone for the evening. So oftentimes storytelling is used to address the current state of the community. So the opening oration can help set the community thinking about whatever might be of interest or concern in the community at that time. It doesn't happen every time in terms of there being an issue of importance to discuss, but sometimes it can. The opening oration, as I said, will remind people of the proper time and place that the story should be told. So treating the stories in a respectful way means that they need to be told in the right season. Then there are different methods by which the stories are recounted. So some folks will memorize a story in English and they'll recount it. We've had great stories retold by elders who chose to sit on the ground, call all the little kids up to sit around them, and read directly from the storybook, or read from a piece of paper that they printed out. So they read the story, but they read it with kind of a living presence, right? They breathed life into the story as they did that. Some folks have learned to tell the whole story in Myaamia in our traditional language, and then they translate it after they complete that story. They translate it into English. So you'll see a wide array of storytelling styles. And we encourage people at the ending of the night to remember that you can take those ideas home with you. So maybe you don't really feel comfortable standing in front of your family at dinner time telling a story like this, but you can sit at the table and read from the storybook together, right? There's lots of different ways outside of the big formal event to continue our storytelling traditions in our home, and we want to model as many of those as we can here for you tonight. The opening oration also reminds people to show proper attention to the stories. So once the story begins, you don't disrupt it. It doesn't mean you can't go to the bathroom, but it means do the best you can not to disrupt your experience or anyone else's experience with that story. Especially, and I tell my kids this all the time, once a story has begun, do not interrupt it. It must continue, right? Because a lot of kids in school today, they're trained that they can kind of ask a question at any time. And in that cultural setting, in that educational environment, that is appropriate. And what my children had to learn is that in this educational setting, because storytelling is educational, it's not appropriate. It doesn't mean you can't ever ask a question, it just means you don't interrupt the story. And Lena, she told a really funny story about, just being at home with her father, Tuaquakanaka, who must have been an amazing storyteller. The amount of knowledge he had about storytelling, I just wish more of that had been recorded, not just the stories themselves. But she said that her and her brother could ask at any time during the wintertime sitting around the fire to tell a story. And he would, if at all possible, he would bend over backwards to tell that story for them. But he always told them, once I begin the story, you have to pay attention to the end. And this is night in the wintertime, the sun's gone down, you're on the fire, and she acknowledged he would start to get drowsy. And he was always holding a little stick in his hand, and if they started to fall asleep, he would switch their foot really quickly to wake them back up again, right? And she told it kind of like as a loving joke that he wasn't really abusing them. But certainly they woke up, right? The idea that you've asked for this, now you have to attend to it and show proper respect for it. So there are no switches here tonight, but we'll ask people to attend to the stories, show them proper respect. And then after the stories have finished, there's usually a wrapping up, closing oration that kind of, again, reminds people of the context, asks people to think about how they can pick these up in their daily life, over the course of the winter after, as well as address any kind of closing issues that the community has that year. And then after the stories finish up, we don't open the floor to questions, but we encourage people to talk about the stories. We encourage you to go up to the storytellers after things finish and ask them questions about the stories. We encourage our community to think about these stories all year round and talk about them. So while you can't tell all of Sufana during the springtime and the summertime and the fall, you can talk about them, you can reference them. They are deeply philosophical and inform our behavior over time and can help us respond to the challenges of today. That means you have to talk about them, but you just can't fully recount them. So we fully do encourage discussion. Discussion of interpretation, for example. One thing that we reference multiple times is that these stories have multiple frames of interpretation, and I have my own thoughts about what a story might mean, but that doesn't mean my thoughts or my beliefs about what a story means are greater or stronger or should carry the day against anyone else's thoughts. One of the major powers of these stories is that they resist single interpretation. And I think that's probably true across all human cultures, that the best stories resist singular interpretations. But I only speak from my experience with Myaamia culture, that that's the strength of our stories. That as I change, the stories, my understanding of the stories change with me. And so what I thought about them 10 years ago or 20 years ago is very different than what I think about them now. And there's a huge power in that. What we have to watch out for in our community going forward is anyone ever saying, well, this is the singular interpretation of what it means when we Kachakwa says, right? I already mentioned no interruption of stories. I'd like to say no applause, but there's going to be a bunch of people coming to the stories tonight who weren't here now, and they'll probably applaud when stories are finished. And I don't think it's a bad thing. That's just not the traditional way in our community that we show our gratitude for something or respect for a performance. It doesn't mean it's offensive. It's just not the typical way we would respond. So I'm not going to, I perhaps should say this a little bit weaker then, maybe no applause. But like the way you can show that you really like something is to go up to the storytellers afterwards and thank them for their stories. There's lots of other ways to show your appreciation beyond clapping. And then lastly, during the storytelling itself, no audio or video recording. We're breathing life into these stories for this moment, for tonight, for our community, and it's meant to live just in that moment, and then it's gone. So we're not trying to capture it. It's not ceremony, I'm not arguing that, but that each storyteller's representation of that story is not intended to exist as a singular moment to define something. It's meant to, for across, beyond tonight. And so we want to just respect that performance that's just existing here. Now, if you want to take still photos, that's fine, because you're not really capturing the life of the story. Just again, follow the guideline of not disturbing anyone when you do that. You don't interrupt other folks' experience with the stories. So lastly, point 4, why do we tell our stories? So again, I'm going to speak from my own experience, and I should say, the collective we is there, but take it as a narrow we. There's still more of us out there, and they're not all here today, and so other folks might have other reasons why we recount our stories. In many ways, I believe, as someone who's been struggling to learn and recount our stories for a while, that we are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and about the world around us. And that's true in both our historical narratives as well as in the Olive Sukana, as well as in the winter stories. And so by recounting our stories together as a community, we reinforce who we are as a people, and we learn and relearn and remind ourselves of the tools we used in the past to solve the problems of the moment. So our stories are not turning us into our ancestors, but they're connecting us with the philosophical thought traditions, the experiences over deep time that our ancestors have had that helped them get us to where we are today. And so it's a representation of deep memory for us as a people, emotional as well as physical, connection to place as well as to things that exist beyond the tangible. There's a great quote from a Cree storyteller who talks about the figure Wisaka among the Cree. They have the same cultural heroes in Myaamia. And he talks about how Wisaka is how the Cree try and wrestle with the unknown. Things that are unknowable across time. And that changes, right? What you can know as a human being does change across time. And so Wisaka's ability to help you wrestle with the things that in your time feel unknowable is really powerful. To play with things that might seem deadly serious and instead make them stupidly funny is really powerful. And thereby, it's how we wrestle with the present, right? So there's a great story of Wisaka that occurs that includes a Frenchman, that includes gunpowder, that includes the fur trade. So Wisaka for a while continued to come with us. And new Wisaka stories developed to help us think about what is this thing, the fur trade? What did it do to us? What happened to us because of it? And at a certain point, because of our cultural loss, because of oppression, because of forced removal, new Wisaka stories stopped being created for a while. And the hope is at some point in the near future, new Wisaka stories will start to come about again to help us continue to wrestle with the present. But the stories we have already have many of the things, the tools we need within them to help us wrestle with who we are. And then for those of you who aren't Myaamia out there, right, the experience is different. The aspects I just described really aren't there for you. But for you, what you can learn is how you learn about who we are. And it's important for friends, for allies, for people that we're in relationship with, to understand who we are, really understand who we are. And it's partly through our stories that you come to know us, and thereby that's how we can link arms together. That's how we can be in alliance together, because you can understand us, we understand you. So again, I should emphasize, maybe that sounded a little bit too much on the deadly serious side of things. First and foremost, in 1824, when kind of an anthropologist, an early anthropologist, you could say, came through Myaamia villages, he said the primary purpose of stories was to just chip away the boredom of winter, right? So it's about laughter. It's about just coming together and having fun. And none of the stuff I'm talking about works if the humor is not there, for sure. Now, not every story has that humor, but most of them do. Or if not, somehow maybe we're not looking hard enough. So we should never forget the fun factor. So this is just a brief synopsis then of what we talked about. What are Myaamia stories? So two types: Achimuna, historical narratives, which can be told any time of year. I don't think we're going to be telling any tonight. Alasukana, winter stories, which are only told in the winter time. They usually involve animals who talk, beings of special abilities like Wisaka who can do just about anything he wants, and despite all those powers, almost always ends up risking his life. Involving a time, those stories, usually it's a time before humans were here in North America. Second, we talked about who are Myaamia storytellers. I named and showed pictures of the people of the past who helped record the main body of our stories that we use today, as well as paid respect to the people who, for generations before, carried that forward. And then talked about the people in our community today of a wide range of ages who have worked hard to learn these stories so that we can share them in our community. Third, we talked about how Myaamia stories are recounted, and I mainly focused on how they're recounted in a formal setting like this. If you want to learn more about informal settings, how to tell stories in your home, there are lots of people in the room here today who do that. We'll be happy to talk to you more about that. But the most basic way is to take out your storybook, open it up, find some stories you want to read them and laugh, and then think about the questions the stories bring to mind. And then lastly, just finish talking about why do we tell our stories, right? And I think a certain upper level umbrella generalization is true of all peoples. right? It's how we frame who we are. What you talk about, what you decide to recount, in many cases defines your community. And the way each community does it is unique. That's what makes us different and unique peoples, right? We're not all trying to be the same. But we can recognize a certain level of connection there. So that's the course of the presentation. And now we've got, I think, a little bit of time for questions. So Coach McCole, what questions do you have?